December 1941, 12 kilometers outside Moscow. The temperature has dropped to minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough that exposed skin blackens in minutes, cold enough that breath freezes before it leaves the mouth, cold enough that metal becomes something closer to ice than steel. A German machine gunner crouches behind his MG-34, fingers wrapped in cloth, because touching the weapon with bare skin means leaving that skin behind. He sees movement in the tree line, Soviet infantry, gray shapes against gray snow, advancing in a skirmish line. He pulls the trigger. Nothing happens. He chambers another round manually, pulls again. The bolt moves sluggishly, catches halfway. The oil inside his precision German engineering has transformed into something with the consistency of cold honey, thick and useless. He tries again. The weapon refuses. 300 meters away, Soviet weapons begin to fire. Not the careful, measured bursts of trained marksmen, but sustained chattering volleys that kick up snow around his position. His loader tries to clear the MG-34, fingers fumbling with mechanisms that no longer move the way they should. The Soviet fire intensifies. Neither German will make it back to their lines. They die in the snow without firing a shot. Killed not by superior tactics or better soldiers, but by physics. This scene repeated itself thousands of times during the first winter of Operation Barbarossa. The Wehrmacht had rolled across Europe with weapons that represented the pinnacle of 1930s engineering. The MG-34 machine gun was a masterpiece of manufacturing precision, with tolerances measured in fractions of a millimeter, with components that fit together like a Swiss watch. The Mauser Kar 98K rifle was accurate at distances the average Soviet conscript could barely see. German optics were unmatched. German metallurgy was world-class. None of it mattered when the temperature dropped below minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit. The closer to minus 40 it went, the more catastrophic the failures became. Bolts froze mid-cycle. Firing pins stuck in place. Recoil springs lost their tension. Lubricants turned solid. Magazines wouldn't feed. Even when German soldiers managed to fire, their weapons jammed after a handful of rounds. The Red Army encountered none of these problems. Their weapons, dismissed by German intelligence as crude, primitive, barely adequate copies of Western designs, functioned flawlessly in conditions that turned German technology into expensive clubs. Soviet machine guns fired sustained bursts when German guns sat silent. Soviet rifles cycled smoothly when Mauser bolts froze solid. The technological superiority that had carried the Wehrmacht to the gates of Moscow evaporated in the Russian winter, and German soldiers died learning a lesson their grandfathers should have taught them. In this climate, simplicity was survival, and complexity was death. The weapon that humiliated German engineering was called the DP-27, the Degtyaryov-Pichotny light machine gun, designed by Vasily Degtyaryov and adopted by the Red Army in 1927. Soviet soldiers called it the record player, a nickname earned by its most distinctive feature, a flat circular pan magazine that sat atop the weapon like a phonograph record waiting to spin. The magazine held 47 rounds of 7.62 by 54 mm ammunition, the same cartridge used in the Mosin-Nagant rifle, which meant logistics officers didn't need to track separate supply chains. The weapon weighed just over 26 pounds loaded, light enough for one man to carry and deploy, heavy enough to maintain stability during sustained fire. It measured 49 inches in overall length. The barrel could be changed in seconds without tools. There was no water jacket, no complex gas regulation system, no intricate locking mechanism that required an armorer's touch to maintain. The DP-27 was simple in a way that Western military observers initially mistook for primitiveness. But Degtyaryov's simplicity was philosophy, not limitation. He designed the DP-27 with a single guiding principle that Soviet weapons designers would follow for the next 70 years. The weapon must function in the hands of a peasant conscript who had never seen a mechanical device more complex than a plow, must function after being dragged through mud, dropped in a river, buried in snow, left in the rain, and stored in conditions that would horrify a German quartermaster. It must function at temperatures that made human survival questionable. It must be manufacturable in factories that lacked precision tooling, maintainable without specialized training, and repairable with a hammer and a file if necessary. These requirements shaped every design decision. The gas operation system used an open-ended gas tube with generous tolerances, allowing ice, dirt, and debris to pass through without binding the action. The recoil spring sat in a housing behind the receiver, where body heat from the operator kept it flexible. The trigger mechanism consisted of fewer than a dozen parts, any of which could be replaced in the field. The pan magazine, mocked by Western observers as awkward and ungainly, fed rounds by gravity assist, making it far less susceptible to spring failure than the enclosed box magazines used by German weapons. When temperatures dropped, the DP-27's wide tolerances became an advantage. Ice formed, but components still moved. Snow packed into the action, but the weapon still cycled. Lubricant froze, but the DP-27 had been designed to function with minimal lubrication or none at all. German weapons were precision instruments built for a different kind of war, for engagements in Western Europe where temperatures rarely dropped below freezing, where supply chains could provide proper maintenance, where weapons could be cleaned and oiled every night in heated billets. The MG-34 required regular lubrication of 37 separate points. Its recoil mechanism relied on precisely calibrated springs that lost effectiveness in extreme cold. Its dual feed system, allowing belts or drums, introduced multiple potential failure points. In temperatures above freezing, the MG-34 was superior in almost every measurable category. It fired faster, more accurately, more reliably. At -40 degrees Fahrenheit, it was an expensive paperweight, and the DP-27 was a functioning weapon. That was the only measurement that mattered. The technical explanation for the DP-27's cold weather performance began with lubrication, or rather, the lack of it. German weapons doctrine called for regular application of precision oils formulated to specific viscosity standards. At normal temperatures, these oils reduced friction and protected metal surfaces. Below -20 degrees Fahrenheit, they congealed into a paste that gummed up moving parts. Soviet doctrine recognized this reality and adapted. DP-27 operators were instructed to remove all oil before winter operations, leaving metal surfaces bare or treated with graphite-based dry lubricants that remained functional at extreme temperatures. The weapon's gas operation system had been designed with this in mind. When a round fired, expanding gases were tapped off through a gas port and directed into a cylinder containing a piston. The piston drove backward, cycling the action and chambering the next round. In the DP-27, this system used oversized components with loose tolerances. The gas port was larger than strictly necessary. The piston fit loosely in its cylinder. The result was a weapon that bled off excess gas pressure and tolerated ice buildup that would have locked tighter mechanism solid. The pan magazine represented another crucial advantage. German drum magazines and box magazines relied on spring tension to feed ammunition. In extreme cold, steel springs lost their temper, providing insufficient force to push rounds into the chamber. The DP-27's pan magazine used gravity as a primary feeding mechanism, with a minimal spring providing assistance. Rounds sat horizontally in the pan and rotated into position, then gravity dropped them into the feedway. Even when the spring weakened in cold weather, gravity continued working. The system was slower and more awkward than a box magazine, but it functioned when others failed. Weight distribution mattered in winter combat. Soviet infantry fought from prone positions in deep snow, dug hasty fighting positions in frozen ground, fired from behind ice ridges and snowdrifts. The DP-27's weight balanced on its bipod created a stable firing platform. The Pan magazine's position on top of the weapon kept it clear of snow. German MG-34 teams struggled with belt-fed ammunition dragging through ice and snow, with drum magazines that needed to be kept elevated and clear. The battles proved the design. At Moscow in December 1941, Soviet defenders used DP-27s to devastating effect against German infantry whose automatic weapons had frozen. At Stalingrad through the winter of 1942 to 1943, the DP-27 provided sustained fire support in temperatures that regularly dropped below minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit. At Leningrad during the 900-day siege, DP-27s fired year-round in conditions that destroyed more sophisticated weapons within days. German after-action reports documented the phenomenon with clinical precision. Soviet infantry squads maintained fire superiority despite inferior training and tactics because their weapons functioned. Wehrmacht units with theoretical superiority in automatic weapons found themselves outgunned because their MG-34s sat silent, while DP-27s chattered. The psychological impact cannot be overstated. German soldiers learned to fear the sound of Soviet machine guns in winter because that sound meant their own weapons had likely failed. The silence of a frozen MG-34 became associated with imminent death. Soviet troops gained confidence from weapons that worked when they pulled the trigger, even when everything else about their situation suggested hopelessness. The DP-27 gave them the one thing that mattered most in combat: reliability. The specifications told a story that Soviet propagandists never needed to exaggerate. The DP-27 fired at a rate of 500 to 600 rounds per minute, substantially slower than the MG-34's 900 rounds per minute or the MG-42's 1,500 rounds per minute. Effective range reached approximately 800 meters, shorter than the MG-34's 2,000 meters. Weight at 26 pounds made it heavier than the American bar at 19 pounds, though lighter than the MG-34 at 26.7 pounds with bipod. On paper, the DP-27 was inferior in almost every category. On the battlefield at minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit, it was the only light machine gun that consistently worked. The British Bren gun, renowned for reliability, struggled in Russian winter conditions due to its tight tolerances and need for proper lubrication. The American BR, beloved by its operators, required careful maintenance and suffered from similar cold weather failures as German weapons. The Soviet Union produced over 790,000 DP-27s between 1927 and 1944, equipping infantry squads across every front. The weapons served through World War II, saw combat in the Korean War, appeared in Vietnam with North Vietnamese forces, and continued appearing in conflicts through the 21st century in Afghanistan, Syria, and various African conflicts. No other light machine gun designed in the 1920s remained in active combat use 90 years later. The design paradox became clear only in retrospect. Western militaries pursued technological advancement through addition, adding features, tightening tolerances, improving precision. Soviet designers, Soviet commutal, achieved battlefield superiority through subtraction, removing complexity, widening tolerances, eliminating failure points. The DP-27 succeeded because Degtyaryov understood that a functioning, simple weapon beat a frozen, sophisticated weapon 100% of the time. German engineers created the MG-34 for an idealized war where weapons could be properly maintained, where temperatures stayed moderate, where supply chains functioned perfectly. Soviet engineers created the DP-27 for the actual war they expected to fight, where conditions would be brutal, maintenance would be minimal, and operators would be poorly trained. When that war came, Soviet assumptions proved correct. A documented account from the Battle of Kursk in July 1943 illustrates the long-term impact. German Panzer Grenadier units equipped with MG-42s. that should have provided overwhelming fire superiority found themselves suppressed by Soviet infantry squads with DP-27s because the German weapons overheated and jammed while the Soviet weapons, designed for abuse, continued functioning. Even in summer, the DP-27's generous tolerances and simple mechanism provided advantages. The weapon that had won the Winter War continued winning in every other season. The final measure of the DP-27's success came from its enemies. German forces captured DP-27s whenever possible and issued them to their own troops, particularly on the Eastern Front. Finnish forces used captured DP-27s throughout the Continuation War and kept them in service into the 1960s. Chinese Communist forces copied the design directly, producing their own version designated the Type 53. The North Koreans manufactured copies. The weapon that Western observers dismissed as crude became one of the most widely distributed light machine guns in history. The engineering lesson proved timeless. Optimal beats maximal in the real world. A weapon that functions reliably under extreme conditions beats a weapon that performs superbly under ideal conditions. The DP-27 won its war not through superior specifications, but through understanding that war is chaos, that conditions are never ideal, that the weapon in your hands must work when you need it most. At minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit, with German precision engineering frozen solid and Soviet simplicity chattering steadily, the lesson was written in blood on snow. The record player kept spinning when everything else stopped, and that made all the difference between victory and death.